Okay. Do I have your permission to record? Arnie? Arnie?
Sorry. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I have your permission to record, sir?
Yes.
Okay.
Um, I know that you don't do. I know that you said you don't do any editing. And so this is just going to whatever I have to say is going to be stuck in the is going to be stuck in the stream. So there might be a little bit of backpedaling
Sure.
because I do have, and clarification,
Sure.
if that's okay. Right?
Sure. Absolutely. The reason that we do that is that these are very skeptical times. And
Indeed.
if there is anything that remotely looks or could be seen to look as though I interpreted something or paraphrased it or something, people just, they lose it and go off and assume the absolute worst within a negative millisecond. So what I do
Oh,
is I go, hey, the person I interviewed introduced themselves as that. And that's the
yes.
way that they
Okay.
wanted to be. So, you can't accuse me of that. Well, so absolutely, paraphrasing, backpedaling, adding more context is totally fine.
Okay. All right. Great.
So, would you introduce yourself and your relation to Hawaii independence, or Hawaii sovereignty, and West Papua independence, sir?
Yes. So my name is Arnie Sakai, and how I entered. Oh, and how I entered into the movement was essentially through Kikuni Blaisdell, who was a independent, activist. He was a doctor in Hawaii, very well respected, and and my affiliation, I suppose, with the movement has sort of have been through him. There's a lot of static on the phone. Can you?
Um,
Hello.
yes.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of static on the phone, as if there's some kind of people speaking in the background, and it's a little disorienting. But anyway, so through so I went through it was through Hawaii State, to the issue around Hawaii statehood, but that's really how I entered into it, and so much of the work that I did around the 50th anniversary of Hawaii statehood is to begin approaching it not as a quote unquote celebration, but as an observation. And part of that is having to do with, I'm tying it into like the loss of the Hawaiian kingdom. And um, and in part because of the work that I've done with Hawaii statehood, I became very closely attuned to the role of the United Nations in decolonization, specifically around UN General Resolution 1514, and which is the declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples,
Right.
and
Right.
so. And sort of, connecting that, as I think, as Toka has mentioned, to the route that Hawaii um, could use to attain statehood, and the belief that Hawaii was removed in 1959 because the United States understood that um, that with the promotion of Resolution 1514, that um, that Hawaii would then have this um, momentum, to push for independence, as many of the other countries did, starting from 1960 on, hence the decade of decolonization between 1960 and 1970. Um, so, so it is through to the vote, through the what we call the statehood plebiscite, and the sort of um, the sort of statistical work that I've done regarding the vote, essentially, showing that 94% of um, Hawaii did not vote for statehood, and reframe that to 34% of um, Hawaii residents because most people chose not to vote. In fact, most people weren't even aware of the options. So
Right.
it's to the act of reaffirming, reasserting, recreating, redoing the referendum, um, or the plebiscite, and having um, having it go through and be observed through the UN process, which then leads us to West Papua, because West Papua there was something fairly similar, which was that there was a plebiscite, there was a vote, a referendum, except only 1,000 and I think 1,010 or 1,020 people voted, and they voted under essentially under gunpoint. So and there was and the thing is West Papua had already been listed on the non-self-governing territories list on the UN. It wasn't one of the original countries listed, like like Hawaii was or like Alaska was, but it was listed there, I think in 1949 until it was removed shortly after, in an agreement what's called the New York Agreement between the United States, the Netherlands, and the new government of Indonesia. There's a little bit of a history, there as well, in terms of what promoted this agreement, but essentially it was around the issues of the Soviet Union, who Indonesia would trade with, a guarantee by Sukarno that that Indonesia would not would not trade with the Soviet Union if the United States gave them West Papua.
Interesting.
So
Interesting.
yeah, there's your quid pro quo, and
yes, topical.
yeah.
Topical. Well done. Well played. Well done.
Yes. So, and so West Papua has had independence movement since there. A lot of people have been jailed, and a lot of people have been killed. There's been a genocide in play in West Papua now for over 50 years. One of the reasons why most people have not heard of it is because Indonesia is very, very tight in terms of journalists and in terms of people going into West Papua. And if you are a journalist and you go in there, and you're followed. There have been journalists who've been shot there, and there's like a level of violence that if you were to if you're interested in, you would unearth a tremendous amount of evidence as to the genocide in West Papua, even statistically. When you're looking at the population rate of West Papua versus Papua New Guinea, and I should just to let you know that West Papua and Papua New Guinea are the same island,
Right.
which
Right.
and they're about the size of California, so it's like you could sort of split it somewhere around San Francisco, and you'll have your West Papua and you'll have your Papua New Guinea, and so when you're looking at the population rise of Papua New Guinea, which is it's still a very poor country, and the rate is consistent with other developing countries. With West Papua, however, it's a dramatic negative turn, and it's striking to see how much of the population has decreased since Indonesia took over West Papua. So the claims of genocide, are statistically, provable.
So if I could, just real quick, you have been given a title or some sort of recognition by West Papua. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, all right. Actually, I have to figure out I have to look at it again because I don't remember the exact title. One moment. pull up this piece of paper.
It was somebody who's
Yeah, here it
a
is. So
recognized leader of West Papua.
okay, so I guess I have been appointed as the ULMWP U.S. Pacific Diplomacy and Solidarity Mission. This is by Benny Wenda, who's the chairman of the ULMWP. And what the ULMWP is the United Liberation Movement of West Papua. And so one of the problems with, earlier on with the Free West Papua movement was that there were different bodies competing for being the legitimate governing body for an independent West Papua. That is no longer the case because the five main groups have unified under the ULMWP, and so that is no longer a legitimate excuse for why West Papua should not or cannot be independent.
And Benny Wanda is
Benny Wenda. He is the he is the head of the Lani tribe, which is the largest tribe. It's one of the highland tribes in West Papua, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it's one of the largest tribal groups, in the Pacific and even possibly in North America. I mean, in the Americas. I mean, there's I don't have the exact figures, but it's very, very large, and he is a chief, I guess, of the Lani tribe or Dani tribe, and he's in political exile. He is living in Oxford, and he does have a visa. He's able to travel to the United States to speak and to go to the United Nations, and very charismatic, very well-spoken gentleman.
So just to summarize for the people listening,
yeah.
that the leader of the consolidated or all the groups brought together in West Papua Independence, there were many of them, now they're all together as one, and their chief or spokesperson from the West Papua Independence Movement, recognized by the UN, said that you could speak for their organization. Is that fair? Is that right?
Yes. That is, yes.
Okay. So what is the West Papua plan to gain independence? What is their step-by-step thing? What is their long-term strategy? What are they hoping to have this happen? What is the legal mechanisms or other peaceful means that they are strategizing to use to get to where West Papua is an independent nation?
Well, that's a really good question, but I don't think I should. I probably should not answer that. And even though I can speak about some things about West Papua in terms of a plan, I don't think that there's something that I could speak about. In part because it didn't. Because it's number one, because it's ongoing, and number two is because the last thing that I would want to do is to try to be any way involved in derailing their independence because of something that they said.
Sure. Well, what could you tell us, or what is it that it's okay to share about how people could help, or the West Papua plan to at least gain recognition? Obviously, there has to be some sort of public talking points that they have. What are those?
So I think generally speaking, it's going through the United Nations. It's going through the Colonization Committee. It will be presented. It will probably come up in one of the General Assembly meetings in 2020. Currently, the ULMWP head office is in Vanuatu, which is one of the Pacific Island countries in Melanesia, and so it is possible that one of the Pacific Island countries will bring it up on the floor of the United Nations to be addressed, and one of the obviously, I think one of the big objectives is to create, to have a new referendum, to have a real referendum, um, and if there is indeed a vote and a referendum that does take place in West Papua, then obviously we would need to have some of the larger countries be there as observers to ensure that that the vote is on the up and up, and that there's a and that it's fair and open and transparent to the public. And so this would involve looking at the big countries, and including the United States, obviously, probably Netherlands, to have a participatory role in the observation um, of the elections.
Okay, so for the listeners there, when the UN was created, every nation had to sign on, and what they signed on to was a recognition that decolonization. The UN wanted to stop wars, it wanted to stop people invading other countries, so it largely froze international boundaries, but they did leave some openings. If you were colonized, you had the right to become that and seek your own independence. That's still
correct.
in the UN. So it sounds like West Papua's trying to go through the UN Charter that says they recognize this effort and trying to get another recognized nation in the UN to bring this up as so that they could get some sort of UN recognition to redo what I think you're calling a illegal vote to make West Papua part of Indonesia. Basically redo the vote.
Yes, it's not dissimilar to what people involved with the Hawaii decolonization struggle, would also recommend is an informed vote for decolonization in order a new vote to become independent. So I do think that there's a difference between Hawaii and West Papua. I think Hawaii has been horribly colonized and overdeveloped. West Papua, on the other hand, hasn't, and it's still fairly remote and fairly undeveloped. And I think that there's very widespread support for West Papua independence. And so if there was a vote in West Papua, and then I think most people would understand that if there was a vote, West Papua would become independent.
You're the people of West Papua independence are that sure that the vote will go that way?
I'm sorry?
The people of West Papua independence are very sure that if they have a vote, and it's legitimate, UN observers, international observers, that majority of the people there are going to say, yes, we want to be free from the country of Indonesia, and we want to become a nation of West Papua.
Yes. There is a caveat to that, however, which is that Indonesia, understanding this process, has also been importing Indonesians by especially from Java into West Papua by the boatloads, and so they've been setting them up, setting up shop. They've really been doing their best to try to raise the population of West Papua by forcing by colonizing it, and so another question that does come up when you're doing a referendum is who vote, and so that there are within the United Nations, the question of who votes is very prevalent, and but whether or not a referendum would recognize who votes, or the ideas of citizenship, or how long people would have to be residents of the area. I think that's something that that's also going to need to be decided and agreed upon within the referendum process.
It's fascinating because when the Calixit movement here has talked to people in Hawaii independence with Polka and Alaska independence, we found similarities with those three far reaches of America, namely that the indigenous populations were basically not allowed to vote. They were disenfranchised. They bussed in or planed in or shipped in people not from the area who were from America. And then they quickly held a vote. And they said, well, the minorities don't get a vote. All these Caucasian people from America who've only been here a year or two, you get a vote. And then they said, vote's legal, moving on. And, they did that with Hawaii, Alaska. While the UN was around, the UN rubber stamped that. And then they did it with California in the 1850s. And wow. And it sounds like Indonesia's planning on doing the same thing.
Well, and strangely enough, this all just happened a couple of years, or actually even like this last year in New Caledonia, because France, France is the administrative power for both Tahiti and New Caledonia, or French Polynesia and New Caledonia, and both of those countries have both of those nations have very, very strong independent movements. But when the vote was done, it was pretty much there were the Kanakis who voted, the indigenous people of New Caledonia, and France brought in a lot of people from France to participate in the elections, and and I said people who have left home. But the vote is going to be redone. The referendum is in New Caledonia is likely to be done again. I actually don't know that much about. I haven't been following it so up close as people who know a lot more about the technicalities of New Caledonia. But now that you bring it up, I mean, I'll be happy to speak with you about it. After I get more details over this issue.
Yeah, we really want to interview somebody from New Caledonia.
Yes.
Reached out to the organization, tried to email. It's tough to get through because we don't speak French. If you have any contacts, we would love to give them a forum to explain their case. Because I bet, like you said, it's probably a horrible story of internationally approved injustice, as we saw with Hawaii, Alaska, California, and now as we're learning about West Papua.
Yes. Yeah, and I do hope that that people are able to at least go online, go to freewestpapua.org, which I think it's a tremendous site, or go to the ulmwp.org website, and and follow what's happening in West Papua, and and the research is astounding because one would never know it, but it completely involves the United States. It involves JFK. It involves Henry Kissinger. Many people don't know this, but West Papua has the largest gold mine in the world. It's called Grasberg Mine, and of course, the company that was running it was this company called Freeport-McMoRan, which Henry Kissinger was on the board of. So I mean, it just keeps going. I mean, you just see U.S. complicitness, and in terms of stealing West Papua's independence, for resources, and especially, for gold. Grasberg also, I think, is also the second largest copper mine in the world. West Papua also has a tremendous amount of gas and oil reserves. I mean, it's a resource intense place. So the idea, so why Indonesia wants to hang on to West Papua and as much as they possibly can, even to the point of under gunplay and under genocide, is because without West Papua, Indonesia would be a lot poorer.
Yeah.
And
yeah. It's
and
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That was it.
No. You were laying it out there. It's a copper mine in West Papua. And
Oh yeah, it's a gold. Well, I think the gold mine is it's a gold mine and a copper mine, but but the gold is I think the bigger talking point, and and um, Freeport McMoran has its headquarters here in Arizona. Um, and they're should be also very very good target because West Papua isn't the only place that they've where they're um, where they're doing a lot of degradation and depletion and active a lot of active mining, blood mining.
so I want to make sure I understand this. You're saying that America helped Indonesia take over or retain control or international recognition of they took over West Papua,
Yes,
basically looked the other way at the vote, and partly it was to keep Indonesia as an ally, and they were going to put up with their worst abuses, and partly it was basically good old American cash. They just wanted money.
yes,
Wow. And
yes.
that Henry Kissinger was one of the people who orchestrated that.
Yes, very much so. And I mean, yeah, I mean, they literally sold out a country for gold.
I got to ask you, recently we've had the impeachment hearings here, and, I don't like Trump. I think he did something bad. They recently had a vote, and they had these professors
Right.
Come forward, and all these people come forward about how bad he is, and he's horrible. And one of the things that got me was that one of the experts they allowed to come forward to testify against Trump talked about how horrible it was that Trump insulted the loyalty of a colonel who I think was born in Ukraine or had some ties to Ukraine, and he was an immigrant, and he was testifying, and so Trump was disparaging this guy, saying, "Oh, he's from Ukraine or an immigrant. He's not really loyal to America." And then this Democrat came forward and says, "How dare you? We have awesome immigrants who come to America and make America awesome and great. And Mr. Trump, you're a monster for insulting this guy because you are not recognizing the greatness of people like Henry Kissinger." And that was
Yes.
a month ago in front of all the Democrats and all the liberals and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton, and no one said, "You just cited a monster as a hero." And if we back up to the election in 2016, Hillary Clinton herself said she was proud to know Henry Kissinger. What does that make you
Yeah.
feel about America and its recognition of democracy to have the Democratic Party and the top candidate for the Democratic president say, "Henry Kissinger's a great guy. We should salute him. He's awesome. He's an example of America being great." And they did that in the last 2 years and up to the last month. What's your take on that?
Um, well, I'm not a well. It's hard. I'm not a big fan of the Democratic Party. I'm certainly not a Republican either. But I think that when we're looking at the Ukraine, and I think one of the most interesting things about the impeachment hearings is how much the Democrats and the Republicans have actually danced around the issue of what the United States actually did in the Ukraine, and why this entire um, what, why Ukraine was uh, let me rephrase that. How Ukraine was taken, how the alliances and allegiances of Ukraine was taken, and it was toppled. It was a coup. It was a Hillary Clinton and Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, orchestrated a coup in the Ukraine in 2014 against Yanukovych. And one of the problems is, and the reason being was, and they call Yanukovych. The reason they called Yanukovych corrupt is because he was essentially turning his back to the EU and was about to realign himself with the EU, which is the Eurasian Economic Union. which was Russia led, and it made perfect sense for the Ukraine to do that, and also be to turning its back on NATO. The European powers, the president of the European Union at that time, and he was livid, that Yanukovych, was had turned his back, to these earlier agreements. But the problem is that what happened in 2008 was a financial collapse. To me, what the signal was, it was a period when the this, the neoliberal economies, the he was essentially collapsed, and it was the it was another cooperation of countries that kept the global economy moving forward, namely Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, what we would call it the BRICS countries, right?
Oh,
And
nice.
and so and those countries, of course, they suffered as well, but for the most part, their economies were fairly stable to the point that that China was able to help bail the United States out with like $2.5 trillion, so when you think back about this trade war, when you think about everything that's going on today with the finger pointing on Russia and China, it's to me the hypocrisy blows my mind, because really, in 2008, 2009, people understood who the real culprits are. They pointed their fingers to the 1%, because it was the 1%. Somewhere between around 2012, 13, 14, 15, with Ukraine, with Syria, suddenly people began to, and now China, people are pointing their fingers not at the 1%, but at Russia and China. And this is, and it's, you can't say that this is something that the GOP did. This is something that Obama, Clinton, Kerry did. Biden. They all did, right? This is what the Democratic Party did. They reframed, the collapse of neoliberalism, and essentially, created this, this new sort of containment and obstruction policy at a global trading, a global obstruction policy. And so anyway, going back to Ukraine, there was a coup. Yanukovych was overthrown. They asserted, a new fascist leader. I forgot what his name is. He was a short interim leader. And then after that, there was Poroshenko. Poroshenko also had his ties and his relationships to the neo-Nazis. And then, Russia did the thing that the West found absolutely I can't just think of what the word is, but
Horrible.
the unforgivable, which is that he, quote unquote, annexed the Crimea, and and Sebastopol, and so of course by and the funny thing is when you look at the votes of this annexation, they were done on the up and up. You can see how many people voted, the population who voted, and and the overwhelming population of the Crimea chose to realign itself with Russia and not remain in this fascist-led Ukraine. For how long this is going to happen for? We don't know. But I think there's a possibility that that there could be an agreement that could happen between the current Ukraine president and Putin. Where they may possibly realign. But the thing is the future is wide open. But the point is in terms of plebiscite and referendum, in terms of the complicitness of the United States and the Democratic Party, in terms of asserting this coup in the Ukraine, it's so and looking at what this impeachment hearing is all about. It's crazy, and also the fact that you have this that it's centered around Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, the vice president at the time, and his role within the gas company. I can't remember what it's called, Burinso whatever it's called. And
Yeah.
and what he did was he took the
Burisma.
asset. He, and this is a company that was, essentially like, a shell company. It's not housed in the United States, not a U.S. company. It's one of those Greek island shell companies that um, that was formed, and it took the assets um, of the Ukrainian national gas company. So it took the proceeds that didn't belong to the Ukrainian people, um, not called, sorry, Gazprom, anyway, and yeah, this path this is clear as day.
So
Joe
I
Biden, Hunter Biden being on the board of this private company of an international consortium of of investors stealing um, Ukrainian Ukraine's national oil, which is essentially what Trump sought to do with Venezuela
well let me
and Bolivia and so forth and so on. I mean, it just goes down the line. But
yeah
yeah,
let me summarize here. So I think what you're saying is that America doesn't always operate with a pure love of democracy and only supporting democracies and only recognizing legitimate votes, and that at times it does its own fair share of underhanded dealings in order to keep allies in its orbit, just like Russia and China.
yeah.
Okay,
Well, mm, that, that's a little bit loaded
fair enough.
because the only reason I say that is because I think that with Russia and China, when we're talking about international agreements, right?
Yeah,
And yes, um, there's a lot of underhandedness that goes on, lots of exchange of money and so on. But generally speaking, um, actually, I would say that Russia and China are really, really good under international agreements. You
okay.
know,
Well,
it's just,
everything you're saying, they don't say out here at all. We don't hear anything like that in any news coverage at all, left or right. Left or right.
yeah.
Never say anything like what you've heard. Now, I've heard a lot of what you're talking about because I read international news. But American news on both sides, nothing close to what you're saying at all. I believe you. And I just
Well,
find
I
it
think
incredible. We don't hear anything like that at all on either the left
right
or right
because
in America.
it's been happening since the UN. I mean, I think that there's a reason why Stalin. Believe me, I'm not a Stalin apologist by any means. But the thing is like what Truman did to Stalin is absolutely insane. I mean, he literally broke every single treaty. And the problem with this, it has to do with the entire narrative of World War II. I mean, of who wins the war, the people who wins, who loses, and so on. But as you probably know, I mean, the Soviets lost more people than anyone during World War II, right? And so,
Yeah, and they won the war.
so they did win the war, and so the meetings around Yalta and Potsdam, which is around the post-war peace process, and then everything was laid out. The winners of this war, they already talked about who was going to get what, and so on, and for better or worse, we might not agree with the decisions that were made in Yalta or Potsdam, but nevertheless, those were the agreements made between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Anyway, all went out the window, and under Truman, and so essentially under the Marshall Plan, and essentially to the point where the United States under the Marshall Plan completely co-opted the United Nations in a very, very short term, from 1948 to 1953, and then what the, and then what the United States took from 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 this international institution, this agreement, was you know the function of the World Bank, the IMF, they co-opted the International Trade Organization, turned it into the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade. They co-opted international unions, which at that time was the WFTU, which was the World Federation of Trade Unions, which was the union that reported to the Secretary General, co-opted that and implemented their own what they called the International Conference on Free Trade Unions, the ICFTU, which is now ITOC, and the ITUC. and I mean, it's inconceivable. And of course, the irony shouldn't be lost upon you that the IFP, um, the International Federation, the ICFTU stands for the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions,
Well, let
not
me
free trade unions. So,
well let me ask you,
yeah.
what what does it mean? West Papua's trying to get independence. You're trying to reach out to America, saying, "Hey, recognize this independence movement." But in fact, it was Henry Kissinger who helped make them under control and oversaw a genocide. And then last month, in front of the American Congress, in front of the American people, in front of all the elected officials and all the liberals, they celebrate Henry Kissinger, and not one says anything like, "Hey, that's the guy that committed a genocide. That's the guy that allowed countries to invade and hold other people under subjugation." Nothing like that. And on the
Nothing like
plan is to reach out to America and ask them to recognize this independence. What do you feel about that?
You know, it's the um, the United States would likely not have a vote because they generally don't vote in terms of like recognizing countries' independence. They're usually the ones who abstain. Um, the or at least that they were that country in the decade of decolonization, right? But it's not up to the United States, I mean, you know, the United States having an observer function during the referendum. I mean, I see the importance of that. Having Germany there, having England there, having some of the old administrative powers. To be there. I think it's important that the elections are overseen. But in terms of the recognition of a free West Papua, I mean that happens within the United Nations. That happens with the UN body, and I do believe that the UN body will vote to recognize West Papua in the same way that they would vote to recognize a free Palestine, in the same way that they would vote. Well, yeah, I mean, for those two countries, I don't know if they would vote to recognize Taiwan like that, which I think is people will often bring up because that's a little bit more of a difficult question. But people would. I think the UN body would vote for a free West Papua in the same way that they would vote for a free Palestine.
Let's we got a few minutes left. I really want to pick your brain about Hawaii independence. What is the thinking? Obviously, we talked to Poka Lanui of Hawaii sovereignty, but we always like probing and asking different people. What is the plan for Hawaii independence? How do they plan to achieve that, or is there an exact plan?
Poka and his associates do have a plan. I do think also that there's a concurrent plan that is also in play with led by Keanu Sai, and this is just the deoccupation perspective. But it's interesting that one of the things that you touched upon in sort of kind of pulling together my start rambling. Did have a lot to do with this international process that happened in the UN and this area of decolonization and what the Marshall Plan had done and all of that and it has to do with Hawaii's independence, and it's that the IOWU was the only organization that I know of that spoke about decolonization in Hawaii in the 1940s, and the ILWU, was very much one of the leading champions for the rights, for granting the rights of independence for countries and peoples, for colonized countries and peoples, right? And And so the discussions that so much of what happened in that period in the 40s and 50s, specifically closer to in the early 50s, with the AFL, the breakup of the AFL and the CIO, the and then of course later on when they got back together, and then the CIO trying to bring the ILW back into its orbit. I mean, all of this happens like around this issue um, um, around around the issues of independence, and I do think that another reason why Hawaii had become why they pushed the vote so quickly had a lot to do with Cuba, because the Southern Democrats in the United States were they didn't want Hawaii to be a state. They didn't want a place where there would obviously be minority representatives in Congress and so forth and so on. They obstructed Hawaii statehood for a very, very long time until they lost Cuba. And so one of the things that we should really pay attention to historically is the idea that the Cuban Revolution, 1959, January 1st, the Hawaii statehood vote, March 1959, 2 months later. And because when they saw Cuba go, they knew that Hawaii was going to go. And the other thing is that the fear of communism was not a fear of communism. It was really a fear of the independence of all of these, of all of these colonized countries. What happened in 1960 completely changed the world, and so we moved from. And I think this. I want this to be like the takeaway.
Okay.
And this is what the United States. This is what the United States has done. All right. I mean, we are a country that's predicated on genocide, on slavery, on theft and fraud. That is our history. It is hard to write a history of the United States that doesn't include genocide, slavery, theft, and fraud. Now, fast forward into 1959 and shut it down in the creation of the United Nations, and it will move to a period where we go from colonization to post-colonization, right? And then what happens again from 1946 to 1960, is this period of post-colonization, because the United States has to refigure out how to maintain those colonial collections. And those colonial collections, I would add, are a result of the Marshall Plan, are a result of the ultimate European administrative powers giving up their colonial possessions, putting them on the UN list of non-self-governing territories, and allowing the United States full access so that they can rebuild Europe using the resources from the colonized countries, building it with AFL, with U.S. labor, and shipping it on U.S. flagged ships to the United States, and then creating this condition. And on top of that, which is also part of the Marshall Plan, which is technically called which is called counterpart funding. That this is what was done, was that the European countries had to deposit their the gold within their central banks into the U.S. Treasury, and the United States at that time also took what was then going to be what Keynes was trying to create as a bancor, which is an independent currency, an independent trade currency, and the United States co-opted it and used a dollar as an international trade currency, using the other country's gold on top of to build to raise a dollar as international trade currency, right?
Nice.
But so then to come 1972 and come Henry Kissinger and all of this period and the Grasberg line and all of this, and then suddenly these countries are now becoming independent, or have become independent from 1960 to 1970. The United States lost, many of the direct access that they had with these resource-rich countries. And so what happened in 1972 is that Nixon, we're now removed from the gold standard, and we removed from the gold standard because we've lost that. We're no longer, we can no longer be this colonial power. And so true post-colonialism, really happens during this period of this great period of decolonization, and then what happens in like with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, and this is where we enter into neoliberalism, and so we have this direct history of sort of this colonial history of genocide theories have been fraud into the post-colonial realm of the United Nations, and then in the post-Soviet collapse period of neoliberalism, all for the sake of privatization, right? And then it comes 2008, it all collapses, and and so we're living in this giant cusp right now. The future is wide open. We have no idea what's going to happen, but we do know that regionally we have the African Continental Free Trade Area that was just promoted, which is like for the very first time in the history, Africa, every country except for I think for one country, but all of the major countries of Africa, 52 countries or 53 countries have now signed on to this. The connection with China and the Belt and Road Initiative, its harmonization with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the possible ratification of the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is stated to be the largest regional trade agreement ever, far larger than the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump withdrew from. And so, all of these things are happening. And what this suggests is that we're looking at a situation where the United States could collapse. What happened in the Soviet Union happened in 1989. There's no reason why it couldn't happen in the United States, considering all of the stuff that that's going on, because it's done. The developing countries, the emerging powers, they're moving on, and they've got a strong trade base. They've got a strong equity base. They're creating new trade rules that the United States is not a part of. And then of course when you throw like new climate negotiations and all of this, the United States is really isolating itself, not as America first, but as America worse. Nobody wants the United States. I mean not that nobody wants it, but it's just that it's really putting itself in a situation of isolation. And with that isolation will come dissolution. And with that dissolution, suddenly something like CalExit, boy, it looks really damn good, because California is a really strong economy. And and the thing is California also has really strong green environmental
standards. And so the rest of Middle America, they don't seem to really care so much, and so California should become independent. It absolutely should. Yes.
So in this narrative, it's such a difficult narrative because you're dealing with so much information, and I know that I'm all over the place, and I really really apologize, for ranting around all of these various issues, but again, the takeaway is really what is America's history, what we were, what we did during the period of colonization, the post-colonial time, the neoliberal era, where we are now, and what the future is, and within that narrative thread, even though I danced around it, there are a million different poles, and then there are some things in the world right now that look really, really good. And the Belt and Road Initiative is one of them, and and the United States has nothing. There's no imagination other than its military.
So let me summarize real quick, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong. So I think what you're saying is, America used to be connected to everybody economically. Right after World War II, underhanded, but it did it. It was connected to Europe. It started taking over the colonies, or at least access to resources. But recently, it can't seem to sign a trade deal with Asia, which was the trade deal, Trans-Pacific Partnership. It wasn't able to sign a trade deal with Europe, as I understand. The French balked at that. And so it's not able to tie its economies to its allies in Europe. It's not able to tie its economies to its allies in Asia. Both of those things were falling apart under Barack Obama. Donald Trump further pulled out, but the Democratic Party outright refused to sign the TPP with Obama. and Obama couldn't
Right.
get the French to agree. So I just want to point out, yeah, Trump's horrible. But to back up your point about where America's going, Europe and Asia were already telling America, nah, you need to do it our way and less your way if we're going to be partners with you. Basically, you need us more than we need you. And if you look back at the European trade deals and the Asian TPP trade deals with Obama, they were already saying that. It's just a continuation. So because America can't tie its economies to its allies, and because Russia's moving up and tying its economies to its former states, and China is tying its economy to the Middle East, Southeast Asia, all the way into Africa and parts of the South Indian Ocean, and because you have trade groups like ASEAN that don't have America part of it, and the Belt and Road Initiative that don't have America part of it, and European countries talking about a NATO or a military alliance without America as part of it, or making their own trade deals with Russia. Basically, world powers are starting to say, we're going to make our own deals, and we're not going to have America in it, or we just don't care if you're there or not. We're not doing it your way because you're in power. It ain't the 1960s anymore. And because of that, America's going to lose its world preeminence. And when that happens, states such as Alaska, Hawaii, California, maybe even Texas, start thinking, maybe even New York City, hey, could I do better on my own? Because having that USA attached to my name doesn't seem to carry any weight or make me any friends or get countries wanting to trade with me. Perhaps if I'm a California or Hawaii, I could do better trade deals and alliances negotiating just by myself.
Yes, and as we're talking about the dissolution of of the United States, and obviously looking at the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a model, right? Um, you know, I think one of the questions that we could also be asking is like what is the role of the quote unquote of the state, of what is and 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 also we have these non-state actors, like Boko Haram, or ISIS, and 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 of course they're seen as terrorists, and I'm certainly not a fan of them, but nevertheless we have to take them seriously a little bit, because they're creating a kind of an economy around in a non-state system, and so the idea of a New York City or of a California or Hawaii or Alaska or of people that belong to a federation, like leading that in order to create another kind of economic or trade integration is not impossible. It's not everything is open, and and what needs to happen is it's all about initiatives and agreements, right?
I don't support ISIS either, but I did find it interesting that when ISIS said, we're leaving Iraq and we're in Syria, but we'll be back to Iraq, and ISIS includes Syria and Iraq, a lot of Westerners were saying, oh, that's crazy. These monsters don't even recognize international boundaries. Here's why they're such bad guys. Now, obviously, ISIS is horrible. But what I found interesting was how quickly the West jumped on, these people are evil because they don't recognize the boundaries set by England and France in the 1930s, which were set under a period of white supremacy and white dominance. It was, we're white, you're not, we know better than you, here's your boundaries. And when ISIS threatened those, you have, again, white people in Europe and white people in America saying, don't touch that! Those are good boundaries. And why are they good boundaries if they were built on white supremacy? And why don't America and Europe say, yeah, ISIS has a point on that. Yes, they're horrible. Yes, they're wrong. But we really shouldn't be supporting things built on, white supremacy and murdering brown-skinned people and denying them access to a legitimate, plebiscite. I mean, why didn't the West say, hey, there's a point there? No one did. What does that say?
Yeah, and of course, the irony shouldn't be lost upon us that what the Kurds are seeking and what ISIS is seeking are oddly enough the same thing.
Exactly.
The Kurds is trying to create a state in exactly the same territory, in exactly the same area that ISIS is, I mean, I mean, the irony is and the hypocrisy is so right, and but you're absolutely right that people are not asking those really really fundamental questions, you know, and I mean some people are. I was at a World Bank meeting around for the Sustainable Development Goals, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, and and I'm talking about Pacific regionalism, right? And Pacific regionalism at that time, I mean, it seemed very it seemed somewhat radical, and people that I had spoken to, just thought it was, just thought it was very airy fairy. This idea of a regionalized Pacific, and the thing is like, and so I went there with that mindset. Then when I go there, and so then there's people there who are like way more radical than I am, who are like, who are simply talking about Boko Haram and ISIS, within the World Bank as non-state actors that, and how trying to figure out how to negotiate with non-state um, with non-state actors. I mean,
Right.
so
Yeah.
I mean, so
Yeah.
it's not that. So people are aware of what's happening, and we need to, and I think facilitating that having this discussion, creating this discussion is what's really really important, because this is what's going to allow people to to rethink what our future is going to be.
That's what we're trying to do, and what shocked us was that, obviously over here in California, we talked about, becoming our own nation, and people said you're crazy, and you guys all smoke pot, and you're brain dead, and a bunch of idiots. And so we started having these Calexit conferences, which is where these interviews came from. And really, the all idea was to show that's not true. If you want to say it's not a good idea, that's fine. But the people behind this idea are educated, informed, well read, aware of the world, and it's just this opposite stereotype. So when we actually started interviewing other independence leaders, we found the same thing. The independence leaders in Alberta, in Baja, in Alaska, in Cascadia, these are smart people who are aware of international law. They aren't brain dead. They're very informed. And yet the media here seems to pursue independence activists as all crazy with no understanding of the law and no real concept about how things work. And I got to tell you, after I've interviewed a couple of them, that is not true. That is
Yeah.
not true. A lot of these people, if you don't like Alaska independence, that's one thing. Fine, debate it on the merits. But to say there's nothing to this and that everybody behind it is just brain dead why is there so much character assassination and misinformation about the people behind independence movements? And why is it a little group out of California is providing a service that frankly should already be done? I should already find 15 interviews with you, 15 interviews with Polka, 15 interviews with Baja, well recorded, put together. There's almost none. Like, there is no audience, or the world media will not allow people who are intelligent and want to have a rational, peaceful conversation about this to really get an audience. Why is that? When we go on and on about democracy and freedom of speech, why does the West not allow or appreciate these thought leaders at all?
Well, I think that's $1 million question. And as a point of reference, I encourage you to, maybe about 15 years ago, Open Democracy, which is this really fantastic media, I don't know what you call it, like a blog, a media scoop, a paper, whatever, but out of England.
Okay.
They had a whole series called Breaking Up Britain, and it included independent activists and voices of very very smart people from Wales, from Ireland, from Scotland, and throughout the UK, talking about this, talking about the issue of breaking up Britain, and I find, and here we are, and then like a decade later, suddenly we're in the midst of Brexit.
Nice.
Which is not to say that they're promoting Brexit per se, because that's not what Brexit is. Brexit was, I mean, it's a little bit of a different thing. But the thing is that, the conversation around the breaking up of the UK is not dissimilar to the to this conversation that that you're having now. And I think that that a lot of people would find it absolutely fascinating and thought provoking, and people would love it.
That's
So, and also I think that you're a really good interviewer. You're able, the fact that you're able to coalesce all of this essentially what amounts to like a crazy person's rant is I highly respect that, and thank you very much for doing that.
Well, I'm part crazy myself on my mother's side, so don't. Uh,
Yeah.
so, couple last. I got one more question I want to ask you that we'll end on, but we're wrapping up here. Before I ask you the last question, websites, your name, titles, key thoughts you want people to be left with, stay in their brain for the next month, or in places you want them to go look at you up online.
Well, I do have a blog. It's called. I haven't written in it so much in the last maybe 3 years, and it's imipono.org. IMIPONO. Once again, IMIPONO. Imipono.org. And I'm one of the moderators for a really, really good Facebook group called the Trade and Globalization Justice. There's no duh, it's just called Trade and Globalization Justice. And so, and other than that, the work that I've been doing has really been around. And in the last 2 years, that's been taking up most of my time, has been done in the Pacific, and it's around the issues of Pacific regionalism, and it's creating an ecological, sort of an ecological framework around valuation, valuating Pacific Island resources, because right now, the Pacific is looking to regionalize, and it's not going to be something that's going to happen, politically or economically, but I think what will happen is through climate, through ecological regionalism, is very promising. Yeah. So that's where I would where I would look. But you can't find an ecological realism, economic regionalism, because there's nothing there, because everything is taking place in house.
Well, let me say, if you know any other independence movements, I would love to interview them. We will give them a fair audience. We will not edit, and we will make sure that they are heard. Definitely want to talk to independence leaders. I think you mentioned another one, Sai, New Caledonia, and then there was another guy out of Hawaii.
Keanu Sai?
Yeah. If you know any of those people or any other independence movements, we just want to give them a voice. Let them be heard. And, they can make their argument. People will think what they're going to think. But we think, if you're going to talk about democracy and freedom of speech and how we need to watch out for China and Russia and their authoritarianism, we need to not be that way. We need to have free conversation, a debate of ideas, and a recognition that people are allowed to vote, and you need to recognize what those votes say. Something which leads me into my last question. So any references you had to other groups, please send them our way. Here's the last question for you, sir. We hear a lot about democracy, and America's the beacon, and it must shield democracy from this new threat of governments that want to not necessarily let the people vote and have everything determined that way. Turkey, Hungary, maybe a little bit of Poland, Russia, parts of Brazil. And then the West looks and says, and this is a two-part question. So part one is the West looks and says, oh, the people of Hong Kong, they want to be independent and free. China, why don't you let them have a vote? Oh my God, China, did you send police people in there to beat them and harass them and arrest them because they want to have a vote? That is a perfect example of how you are a totalitarian country, and we in Europe and America and the rest of the democratic nations are disgusted, and we stand against you because we love democracy and clearly you don't. At the same time, there's Spain. And Spain said, Catalonia, you do not get to have a vote. And if you do, we're going to send police into the streets to beat you and crack grandmothers' heads open so they're bleeding because you wanted to have a vote. There was no signs of violence. They went in, beat those people down, sent SWAT teams with machine guns to collect the ballots, and arrested leaders. What's the difference between Spain and China?
Well, I love that question, and it's true. I do think that you asked the right, you asked the right questions once again. I want to go back I want to answer that. But before I answer that, I do want to suggest one person to be on your show.
Yes.
Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz.
Okay, done.
And because she wrote, an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, and she knows so much about the treaties that were signed between the United States and the Indian nations, and of course, they weren't recognized because Indian nations were not considered to be, they weren't recognized within the family of nations, right? So, that's one. Because I think that having that conversation about, in terms of breaking up, or dissolving, these notions of these enormous state apparatuses, can only happen and will and hopefully will happen with the participation of U.S. First Nations peoples. So having said that, then talking about democracy, and then this is where I'm not a big. I don't put democracy at the top of the list. I mean, historically, when you think about the quote unquote the democratic experiments that took place in Greece and Rome, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I think when they implemented democracy in Greece, it lasted for about 100 years. But of course, the majority of the people in Greece at the time were slaves, and of course, they were only men who owned property. So, so it's hard to talk about, these sort of the fundamentals of democracy when you have slavery, and so I do think that there'd be a really, really good study, a historical study that I don't know if anyone has done it, but it would be a really great thing to do, to statistically look at these democratic experiments in conjunction with, with slavery, because then I think you would find that democracies have only been made possible as a result of slavery. And in the United States, how we could begin to look at the liberal democracy, we can look at wage slavery, because wage slavery, keeping people, having a majority of people who are very, very poor, in this country, and I mean, there's a lot of ways in which you can manipulate people who are poor and quote unquote uneducated, and the media is one of them. So then when we're talking about democracy, are we talking about mob rules or who votes once again? And then all of these principles, I mean, they're difficult, and it's hard to get any kind of like a pat definition of how things should move. But one thing that I do believe is that notions like democracy, capitalism, communism, I mean, those are like constructs to some degree that I think it's like we should have leave them buried in the 20th century.
Well,
they don't make sense anymore.
But let me sympathize. Let me boil it down, because you're obviously someone who's well informed about international events. China says you don't get a vote. We're sending in the police. We're going to crack heads. We're going to arrest leaders. Spain says to Catalonia, you don't get a vote. We're going to send in SWAT teams. We're going to send in police. We're going to crack heads. But what's the difference?
Yeah, I mean there is no difference. I mean, the thing is, I'm not a sympathizer of the Hong Kong democracy movement, quote unquote democracy movement, and I do sympathize very much, more so with the Catalonia independence movement. Why is that? I mean, it's interesting because I question that myself. Like what is it about the Hong Kong independence movement that I distrust or that I don't like? I know that one of them is the fact that most of the people who who are in front of this democracy movement, are privileged kids, and they're privileged kids
I saw that.
who've learned a colonial history, and who's been indoctrinated by a colonial history, and who want to go back to a colonial to the sort of like colonial neoliberal like mandate without understanding that it is precisely this political economic policies that have that collapsed the West to begin with, and and whereas with the Catalonian movement, I mean, that's a movement that's been going on for for decades, and they have a very strong progressive Marxist history, and so is it just that I'm privileging a kind of like Marxist anti-colonial like approach to these quote unquote democracy movements over these these over the neoliberal ones, over forced privatization of people and forced oppression? And I think I am, because I do hold that as a higher standard than I do with everybody vote.
Interesting.
So
Interesting. I had to ask because I'm asking that question and I see the West go on and on about how they love democracy, and I go, what about Catalonia? How can you criticize China for doing the exact same thing that part of Europe is doing? If you love democracy, you should be condemning Spain as vociferously and valiantly as you do China, and yet that don't happen at all. Almost seems hypocritical.
I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Seems hypocritical and Janus-faced, and I find that interesting when we talk about independence movements because it brings me back to international recognition. Folks, get it straight. Just because you want to have a vote and achieve independence doesn't mean that the West is going to be your buddy and automatically recognize you as the good guy. It's about money, and it's about posturing against other powers. And if you can make those two things work, then you got a chance. Don't be naive and study something called realpolitik, because that's how the world operates. And you can tell by looking at the way that Europe and America condemn China and salute Spain for doing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll end it there. I will email you a copy of this, and I'll talk to you on email. I definitely want to get those contacts from you, and we'll go forward, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you. It was great chatting with you, and thank you again for listening.
Thank you, Arnie. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.